Hello again, and welcome to our series of lectures on foundations of Western civilization. This will be lecture number 17, and we're going to talk about the government and institutions of the Roman Republic. Now, you may recall that last time we put the Romans on the map, quite literally. We talked a little about the geography of Italy. We talked about who the Romans were, the early Romans. We talked about their neighbors, the Etruscans, the Greeks to the south, and so on. And we talked about the rather intense political and social turmoil that marked the first couple of centuries of the history of the Roman people, and how one result of that turmoil was a situation where social and economic distinctions were to some degree effaced so that all Romans could participate pretty much fully and equally in Roman political life. What we want to turn to today, then, is the kind of government they created, and we want to talk a little bit about how that government actually worked, what the institutions were, what the officers were. I want to talk a little bit about the social values that underlay that government. And finally, we'll reflect a little on that government through the eyes of the Greek historian Polybius. Now, much that we say towards the end of this lecture will seem very familiar because Thomas Jefferson knew Polybius. And some of Polybius's ideas were writ right into the American Constitution. Now, the Roman government, like others, was partly institutions. Was partly ideologies, fundamental governing underlying ideas. It was fundamentally social practices that evolved, that changed over time, and it was fundamentally the product of historical experience. The Romans liked to think of themselves as being sort of sturdy, stable, and unchanging. In fact, as we'll see in this and in subsequent lectures, things changed a good deal. One of the things that's particularly interesting to us about the Roman government is because of the nature of the information that survives the sources, we know a great deal about it. We know far more about the Romans than we do, for example, about the Greeks or indeed about any of the peoples whom we discussed in the ancient Near East, or the Egyptians, for example. All right, then, the Roman Constitution in the first place, then something about Roman society, then something about ideologies. The Roman Constitution was in the first place led by a series of magistrates. Now, when we talk about the magistrates of the Roman Republic, there's two principles that we need to keep in mind. The first of these is collegiality. They worked as a college of officers, as a group of men, they were all men, bound together and in some ways required to cooperate with each other to facilitate one another's work. We'll see some concrete examples of that in just a second. In the second place, annuality. They were elected every year. All of the Roman magistrates, with one exception, one peculiar exception that we'll describe in a few minutes, all of the Roman magistrates were elected annually. Now, we have elections sort of every 4 years, or maybe local elections every 2 years. Imagine the Romans, an election every year. The highest magistrate of the Roman Republic was the consul. The consul. Of these, there were two. They were elected annually. They convened the Roman voting assemblies. That was one of their primary responsibilities. We'll talk about those voting assemblies in a few minutes. They led the Roman army. And ex-consuls automatically entered the Roman Senate. We'll talk about the Roman Senate in a few moments. But for the moment, let's just say the consuls are the chief executive officers of the Roman state. Next, there were the praetors. The praetors were the judicial officers of the Roman state. Originally, there were two of these. As Rome got larger, as its business grew more complicated, the number of praetors eventually expanded to as many as 8. They presided in the courts. This was their fundamental day in and day out responsibility. They presided in the Roman courts. They weren't exactly judges in our sense of the term, but we might think of them by analogy to judges. Perhaps in the long term, historically, the most important thing about the praetors is that on taking office each year, they issued a praetor's edict. Now, this would be a basic statement of what their priorities would be, what their goals would be, what the essential things that they would work on during their year in office would be. But those praetor's edicts gradually added together and built up the body of Roman law. This is really a fundamental source for Roman law. Like the consuls, the praetors entered the Senate on conclusion of their year in office. Next, there were officials called quaestors. Now, the quaestors were essentially the financial officers of the Roman state. They received taxes, they received fines when persons were fined, for example, in courts of law. They received tributes, tributes paid to the Romans by peoples whom they had conquered. They let out state contracts for such things as waterworks, for such things as road building. Now, this was an opportunity for considerable peculation. Letting out public contracts has sometimes been a bit seedy in modern times, and it was much the same in Roman times. Quaestors often were able to use their year in office as a way both to enrich themselves and also to earn the favor of large numbers of people in Roman society, for whom they did sometimes very large favors. They, again, were elected annually, but they could also be appointed by the consuls. When there was a need for extraordinary quaestors, the consuls could actually appoint quaestors. As with the other officers, initially there were two, and then over time the number grew. There was never after the very early days of the Republic, there was no longer a fixed number of quaestors. There might be 2 or 4 or 6 or 8. It just depended a little bit on circumstances. And ex-quaestors, like the other ex-officers, entered the Roman Senate. There were next aediles. Now, the aediles had responsibility for the food supply. That was really one of their key responsibilities. They also had responsibilities for public buildings in Rome. As the city of Rome grew, as it became a larger city, a more complex city, a more sophisticated city, that was a very large responsibility. They also had responsibility for the streets of Rome, which also meant for the sewers of Rome. And they also were responsible for putting on games and public entertainments. This, as Rome grew larger, as the city grew more complex, was again a very important responsibility. Aediles did not enter the Senate automatically on the conclusion of their term of office. Generally, one would, if one held the aedileship, for example, at a little bit later time, one would move on to hold a different one of the other offices and then perhaps move on into the Senate. You may just remember that in our last lecture we had talked about the tribunes. During the times when the plebeians had seceded from the Roman state, had in effect gone on strike in order to secure their interests, on one of those occasions, they were accorded the privilege of choosing 10 of their number as tribunes, who would then be sort of persons charged with responsibility for the best interests of the ordinary people. And you'll remember they had the power to veto acts of the magistrates and the assemblies. They could, for example, sit outside the assembly halls if they were not elected members, and if they didn't like the direction that the debate inside was taking, they could shout, "Veto, I forbid," and the discussion came to an end. So the tribunes lacked, in a sense, under the Republican Constitution, some of the reason for being that had brought them into place in the first instance. After 287, when patricians and plebeians were essentially equal and could hold all offices, it was a little less important for the tribunes to be there to look out for the interest of the plebs. But nevertheless, right through the Roman Republic, the 10 tribunes continued to be elected. And on some occasions, late in the history of the Republic, they played a very decisive role in Roman politics. We'll come to that a couple of lectures down the road. There were finally 2 censors. Remember I said everybody's elected annually with one exception? Well, here's the exception. There's 2 of them, so we might say it's 2 exceptions, but it's only 1 officer. Every 5 years, 2 censors were chosen. They served for 18 months, then they went out of office. So then for 3.5 years, there were no censors, and they were elected again. They had 2 responsibilities. And if you think about it, the word censor to us can imply 2 different things. In the first place, the Roman censors fixed the census status of citizens. Now, what that means, I'll explain in just a second. They fixed the census status of citizens, and they issued rules on public morality. So even today, we think of a censor as the person who every 10 years knocks on your door and counts everybody in your house, or the censor who tells you what books you can read or not read, or what movies you should see. So the censors at Rome had both those responsibilities, but their fundamental responsibility was to fix the census status of Roman citizens. Thus far, then, the magistrates of the Roman state. There were occasionally some minor officials, but that is basically the group of magistrates who, from the earliest days of the Republic until its end, led, organized, managed, governed, functioned as sort of the chief executive of this Roman state. The voting assemblies, then. How did the Romans legislate? How did the Romans come together, discuss their public business, and take action? They had a series of different assemblies, which are related to one another in rather complicated ways, and so it's sometimes a little hard to grasp exactly how the Roman system worked. I'll see if I can't at least shed some light on the situation. In very early times, there was a body called the Curiate Assembly. This goes all the way back to the time when Rome had kings. It withered under the Republic and is really not particularly important, though if you were to read some early Roman history, you might see mention of this. But in the high period of the Republic, it's not really important and needn't engage our attention here. There was also a plebeian council, but this council also, after the Licinian Sextian laws in 287, granted essential equality to the decisions of the plebs and the decisions of the centuriate assembly. The plebeian council, the old plebeian council, also withered. It really didn't have the kind of significance it once did. So that leaves us with the fundamental institutions, the fundamental legislative institutions, or deliberative bodies of the Roman people. First, the Senate. Now, the Latin word senatus is derived from the Latin word senex, which means old man. You'll remember perhaps at Sparta that it was the group of old men who governed the state. So too at Rome, a body which was in some sense imagined as that of the older or the wiser men had prime responsibility in the Roman state. But there is an irony. It was made up originally of patricians and eventually open to all. It was made up of ex-office holders. It had the fundamental responsibility of passing treaties, but it could not legislate. The Roman Senate did not pass laws. And Rome did not function with a bicameral or even indeed with a multicameral legislature. That is to say, issues discussed in one of the other assemblies, to which we'll turn in just a second, did not come up to the Senate for resolution. The Senate had no role. Well, it did have a certain kind of role. I'll come to that in a minute. It had no formal role in legislation. It could not pass laws. There was then the tribal assembly. Now, the tribal assembly constituted the Roman people organized according to districts. Here was one of the great acts of gerrymandering in human history. There were 4 districts, so tribe means district. Tribe does not mean a group of people related to one another. Maybe way, way back in Roman history there was some hint, some suggestion, some notion that people living together in a certain area would then act together publicly. Whatever might have been the case, once we enter the historical period, tribe means district. There were 4 districts in the city and 29 in the countryside surrounding it. By the time, let's say, of the birth of Christ, the city of Rome had about 1 million people. So all of those people had basically 4 districts, you see, and the people on the outside of the city had about 29. That was always a boon to the wealthy landowners who had managed this system. Its institutional consequences we'll see in just a second. There was in the second place the centuriate assembly, the assembly by centuries. Now, what exactly is a century? Well, it's 100. That's easy enough. Was this originally a group of 100 citizens organized for some purposes? Was it a military band of 100 men organized perhaps for domestic defense in the event that Rome were attacked? We don't really know. We don't really know what the point of the word century is. By the time we enter the historic period, centuries were groups of people grouped by wealth. Now we come back to our censors. Every 5 years, the censors, try to say that fast, the censors tried to assess the wealth of all the Roman citizens. And according to their wealth, it placed them in census classes. It placed them in one of 192 centuries. Now you'll be asking yourself, why 192? And I can't tell you. We don't know. But there were 192 centuries. Like the tribal assembly, the centuriate assembly was also gerrymandered. That is to say, about 10% of the Roman population constituted about the first 100 centuries. The remaining 90 or so centuries involved about 90% of the population. Now we're going to see how the Romans voted in just a moment, and you'll see with particular clarity why that fact is significant. All right? So, the tribal assembly and the centuriate assembly, the fundamental voting assemblies of the Roman people, the fundamental assemblies that passed Roman laws. Now, how do we start the process? Legislation could be introduced by the magistrates. A consul, a praetor, could introduce into one of the assemblies a piece of proposed legislation. Bills were then read 3 times in the Roman Forum. They were read from the rostrum in the Roman Forum to whatever people gathered. If it were a great controversial issue, there would perhaps be lots of people there. If it was a relatively minor point, there might be very few people around. But the bills were read out 3 times publicly. Does any of this begin to sound a bit familiar? I think so. Huh? These issues were then vigorously debated by the Roman people and then voted upon. Now we come to the significance of that gerrymandering to which I was referring just a moment ago. The Roman assemblies used the system of block voting. In other words, it made no difference how large the Roman population was. The tribal assembly had 33 votes to cast. The centuriate assembly had 192 votes to cast. How did they work? The centuries would come together when the centuriate assembly was called, and this was direct democracy. It was not a republican system in the sense that these were elected representatives of people. Every Roman citizen was automatically a member of a tribe, because he lived somewhere, and a member of a century, because he had some wealth that fixed him in a certain status, in a certain category. The centuriate assembly would come together, and each assembly, one after the other, would debate the issue that was before the Roman people, would vote among themselves, and cast a vote. So century 1 casts a vote, for or against the measure. Century 2 casts a vote, for or against the measure. Century 3 casts a vote, for or against the measure, and so on. Now remember a moment ago I had said that about 10% of the Roman people made up about 100 of the centuries. What that meant is about 10% of the Roman people could cast about 100 votes, and normally, not always, sometimes issues were controversial, produce a little splitting, but normally, the issue would be decided before the vast majority of people ever voted. And yet, everyone participated, everyone voted. It looked as though all were equals. In the tribal assembly, people came together in a voting hall, which archaeologists have discovered and elucidated very clearly in Rome. It was arranged in a series of long stalls. And at the front of the room was a rostrum, a podium, with an urn. The tribes would gather together again, all right? Tribe 1 gathers together, and they would discuss the issue. And then each member of the tribe would walk to the front and walk past an urn and drop in either a white pebble, that's a vote for the measure, or a black pebble, that's a vote against the measure. There's the origin of being blackballed. When all of Tribe 1 had voted, the urn was emptied out, the pebbles were counted. There's now a vote for or against the measure. And Tribe 2 votes. Now it'll occur to you, perhaps, that here is the origin of our electoral college. Block voting. In other words, it didn't make any difference. If Tribe 1 had 10 people and Tribe 2 had 100,000 people, each had a vote. Didn't make any difference. One vote per tribe, one vote per century. Okay, if we think about that system for a moment, we can see that it's rife with ironies. On the one hand, everyone participates, everyone votes, everyone seems to function equally. On the other hand, the system is managed in such a way as to leave the most wealthy, most powerful, most influential citizens with the opportunity to decide issues before they actually get to the great mass of people. So if we wonder a little bit why, on the one hand, Roman society was so stable for so long, and on the other hand, why there was always a certain volatility just below the surface, we can see it in these very voting assemblies. Okay, thus far the system in its formal exterior aspects. That's just what it looked like. Now let's ask ourselves, how did it actually work? In other words, for instance, I mean, imagine a space visitor from Mars who landed in Washington this morning and said, well, gee, this is an interesting place I've arrived. How does it work? And somebody said, well, here's the Constitution. Read this over and you'll see how it worked. Well, I dare say the person could read our Constitution and wouldn't probably know how our system worked. I mean, think of all the attitudes, the values, the historical experience that simply isn't expressed in that document. So, in a way, what we've talked about till now is the Roman Constitution. Now what we want to say is, how did it work? Okay, what were some of its underlying principles? First, the Romans paid enormous deference to age, experience, and tradition. Rome was a hierarchical society, and Rome was a deferential society. There was a culture of deference, a very powerful culture of deference at Rome. Certain citizens, certain traditions, certain ways of doing things were accorded great weight by the Romans. The second place, and we can see this in a way as a manifestation of the point that I just made, the oldest member of the Senate, the princeps senatus, the prince of the Senate, always spoke first. I said a moment ago the Senate could not pass laws, and that's right. But the Senate could issue opinions. Senatus consulta, opinions of the Senate. Now, in this culture of deference, when the Roman Senate knew that a certain issue was before the Roman people, a certain issue was being debated, and they said, it is our opinion that this course of action or that course of action should be followed, this carried enormous weight. It had no binding legal force. A senatus consultum didn't have binding legal force, but it carried a tremendous amount of weight. Now let's imagine the Senate. The oldest member rises and speaks first. And then, one after another, the senators speak on an issue. Now imagine one of the younger members of the Senate, one of the newer members of the Senate. Is he going to stand up and say, well, old man, that's all very well and good, but I have a new idea. Let's do something different. No. The younger man, to make his way, is going to stand up and say, oh, that's brilliant. Yes, I agree completely with that. And there would be a tendency for the old men, senatus senex, Senate, body of old men, to govern. And old would mean old by age, but also old by experience. The tribes and the centuries caucused before voting. Before they actually began casting their ballots, they caucused. That's another good Roman word, caucus. And in the caucus, the seniores always spoke and voted before the juniores. Seniores, the older men. Juniores, juniors, the younger men. Well, once again, when the younger men watched what their older, more experienced fellows were doing, were saying, and how they were voting, it was in their interest to go along. They want to make their way in the society. They want someday to be important and influential people, you see? So they're not going to be rebellious. At least for a long, long time in Roman society, they were not going to be rebellious. Patron-client bonds were critical to the operation of Roman society as a whole. Rich and powerful people had large numbers of people in various degrees of obligation to them. These might be people whom they had helped financially. These might be people whom they had helped in a court of law. These might be people for whom a generation or two earlier their families had done a favor, had done a good turn. The patron-client bond could be formed for lots and lots of reasons. But influential people at Rome, remember those tribes, districts, and centuries, wealth groups, many influential people at Rome could count on the votes of a large number of people who owed them something. Now that again is not written into the Roman Constitution, but it's there, and it's a crucial part of how it worked. And if you think about it for just a moment, that's not unrelated to this culture of deference to which I referred a moment ago. Now, one of the interesting results of this set of social and political values that attach to the Constitution we described, a remarkably small number of families, about 100, provided almost all the officers of the Roman Republic during the first 400 years of its existence. Now that's a very small number of families. Historians therefore speak about a senatorial aristocracy, because the point is, of course, that the higher magistrates then entered the Senate. Now, we could say in a way that this is perhaps understandable before the attainment of something like political equality and democracy with the Licinian Sextian laws in 287. It's a little harder to understand thereafter as a political fact, just as a fact of logic, you see. But it's easier to understand when we reflect on this culture of deference. The Romans simply paid deference to certain people. There were two Roman political values that it seems to me help us a little bit more to understand this process. The first of these is auctoritas. Now that's a Latin word from which we get the English word authority. In the Roman context, this laid great stress on the eminence, the inner dignity of the greatest citizens. The idea was that certain people were intrinsically more eminent than others, and therefore ought to be observed, to be followed, to be listened to. It wasn't a matter of wealth, it wasn't a matter of birth, it wasn't a matter of power, it was a matter of inner qualities, you see? Now, even to this day, we draw a distinction between authority and power. That's a Roman distinction. Authority is legitimacy. Power is mere brute force, you see? And to the Romans, that legitimacy flowed from certain inner qualities of people, not simply because they had a lot of power. The second issue, the second principle to which I want to draw your attention is the mos maiorum, the custom of our ancestors. This was to the Romans their guiding light in all things. Did they ever change? Of course they did. But they never admitted to changing. This is how Roman speeches began. Here is what our ancestors did. What would our ancestors have done? There was always this tendency, this sense, this powerful feeling that one must go back to the good old days. So the authority of eminent citizens, and then more particularly the authority of eminent citizens from the past, explained to the Romans how their system was supposed to work. Now, perhaps the greatest critique and assessment of this system came from the Greek historian Polybius. He was born about 200 BC, died in 118. He was captured by the Romans during their wars in the Balkans. We'll turn to those wars in our next lecture. He was a very learned Greek, and he set out to write a history of his times. Now, he lived among influential Romans. He lived a very, very elegant and graceful life, even though he was sort of a prisoner of war. He wrote a massive history of the Hellenistic world, that world that we talked about a couple of lectures back. And Book 6 of this is a penetrating analysis of Rome's system. Polybius wanted to understand, he was sort of a haughty Greek, he wanted to understand how a people so recently barbarian had come to conquer virtually the whole known world. He attributed their success to what he called their mixed constitution. He said the Romans had consuls who were very much like kings. There's a monarchical dimension. The Roman Senate were like aristocrats. There was an oligarchical dimension, ruled by a few. And the assemblies were like the demos in a Greek city, democracy, the rule by the many. Now, Polybius had a characteristically Greek view of the cyclical evolution of politics. Remember, in antiquity, people generally, the Hebrews were different, and we'll see later on that the Christians were different, but among ancient peoples generally, it was thought that life revolved in great cycles. The Wheel of Fortune was not a television program in antiquity, it was a philosophical way of talking about how everything works. There was a notion that there was a natural evolution of societies. Starting with monarchy, the rule of a strong person. Eventually, the monarch would have to share power with some number of people, and we would move to oligarchy. Oligarchs would then gradually have to share power with a larger number of people, and we would have democracy, ruled by the people. A certain number of the people, of the demos, would then begin to rule selfishly in their own interest. We would have mob rule. And mob rule would then be ended by the man on a horse, by the strong man, by the monarch, who comes in and brings order and, in a sense, brings us back round to the top, or if you will, the bottom of the circle, and the cycle begins again. What intrigued Polybius so much about the Romans was he believed somehow that they had escaped the cycle, that their mixed constitution, their balanced constitution, had enabled them to break out of this vicious cycle of political change. Was Polybius right? Yes and no. Now, the Roman system was remarkably stable for a long time, and the mixed dimension of this constitution was there for all to see. And as I said, it was admired very much by the founding fathers of the United States. There are a lot of things Polybius, for example, didn't tell us. Now, he lived among great people. He ought to have known. But he didn't tell us, for example, anything about the culture of deference. He didn't tell us anything about the senatorial aristocracy. He didn't tell us anything about the relatively small number of families who had monopolized political power over a very long period of time. So it's curious in a way, you see, that Polybius notes certain aspects very penetratingly of the Roman system and seems to ignore others. But finally, and perhaps most ironic, Polybius lived at Rome at the very moment when the Romans were building a vast empire. One of the things he didn't notice was the kinds of strains and tensions that the creation of this empire produced for a small, face-to-face, deferential political system. That said, the Roman system has been, in terms of strict institutional structures and in terms of ideological ideas, formative in the Western tradition. In our next lecture, we'll turn to the strains produced by the creation of the Roman Empire.